You look at Mel Brooks and you see the history of comedy. You see a man who is 99 years old, a man who has outlived his wife, his best friends, and almost his entire generation. He is supposed to be the man who makes the world laugh, the man who spent every single evening with Carl Reiner, eating dinner on trays and watching Jeopardy until the very end. But when the cameras found him yesterday outside that quiet, secluded home where he has spent the last few years in semi-retirement, there was no laughter. There was no joke to break the tension. There was only a man who looked like the entire century had finally collapsed on top of his shoulders. For days, the world has been spinning with the headlines about Rob Reiner. The brutal nature of the crime, the arrest of his son Nick, the absolute shock of a Hollywood dynasty crumbling in a single night of violence. But while the news anchors discuss court dates and police reports, Mel Brooks remained silent. And that silence was louder than anything else, because everyone in this town knows that Mel was not just Rob's father's best friend. He was Rob's second father. He was Uncle Mel. He was the man who changed Rob's diapers, the man who guided him when he transitioned from meathead to one of the most respected directors in the world. So when Mel finally invited a single trusted journalist into his living room with no cameras and just a tape recorder and began to speak, it was not a press release. It was a confession. And what he said changes everything we thought we knew about what happened inside that house in Brentwood. Mel did not start by talking about the murder. He started by talking about guilt. He sat in his armchair with his hands shaking slightly, not from age, but from a rage he has been suppressing for years. He said that people are calling this a tragedy or a sudden snap of mental illness. Mel looked up with eyes sharp and wet and said this was not an accident and it was not sudden. We watched this slow-motion car crash for 10 years, and we let it happen because we loved Rob too much to tell him he was wrong. This is the part that hurts to hear. Mel Brooks admitted that the inner circle knew that Nick Reiner was a ticking time bomb. The story of the Reiner family is not just a story of wealth, but of a specific kind of American royalty, built on the architecture of a laugh. To understand the tragedy that unfolded in Brentwood, one must look back at the shadow that loomed over that house. The dynasty began with Carl Reiner, a man who did not just write comedy, but invented the modern language of it. Alongside Mel Brooks, he created the iconic 2,000-year-old man, which was a partnership that defined their lives for over 50 years. Carl's home was the blueprint for a place where professional success and family stability seemed to blend perfectly. For Rob Reiner, growing up as the son of such a giant was a double-edged sword. He famously recalled being so awed by his father that he once wanted to change his own name to Carl. Yet he was determined to forge his own path. Rob succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. He transitioned from being Michael "Meathead" Stivic on All in the Family to becoming one of the most successful directors in Hollywood history. With the founding of Castle Rock Entertainment, he built an empire that produced cultural touchstones. By late 2025, his fortune was built on stories of hope and the fundamental goodness of people. But as Mel Brooks points out, being the third generation in a dynasty where the first two are legends is a weight that requires immense strength. Nick Reiner, born in the early 90s, entered a world of absolute abundance and high expectations. Unlike his grandfather Carl or his father Rob, Nick struggled to find his footing. He had talent and even contributed to a film inspired by his own years of addiction. But the shadow of his father's success eventually became a source of resentment rather than inspiration. Mel Brooks reveals that Nick began to blame the shadow for his own lack of joy. He saw his father's success not as a gift, but as a thief that had stolen his own potential. In the final years leading up to the tragedy, this resentment curdled into a psychological break. The Brentwood estate became a gilded cage where the rot of this generational tension was eating through the foundation. What the world saw as a Hollywood success story was behind closed doors a dynasty in the final stages of a violent collapse. Mel Brooks reveals that what the world saw as a series of unfortunate setbacks was in reality a 10-year slow-motion car crash. While the public knew of Nick Reiner's struggles, they did not see the ticking time bomb that Mel says the inner circle was forced to witness. Mel's confession highlights a disturbing shift in Nick's behavior approximately a decade ago. Despite having undergone nearly 20 rehabilitation treatments since the age of 15, Nick began to slip further into a state that Mel describes as delusional and aggressive. Just weeks before the tragedy, reports emerged that Nick had been struggling with deep psychological instability. While medical records have seen conflicting interpretations, the narrative from the Reiner household was one of increasing instability. Mel explains that the family's wealth became a double-edged sword. The high-end rehabilitation facilities became a revolving door that failed to interrupt the cycle. In fact, Mel revealed that by the last 2 years, Nick's substance abuse had severely worsened his psychiatric symptoms, creating a volatile cocktail of drug-induced psychosis and resentment. The bomb nearly detonated several times before the final night. Mel recounted an afternoon 6 months ago when Rob came to his home not to eat, but to pace in a state of visible terror. Rob admitted that Nick had returned to the Brentwood estate after another failed stint in rehab, but this time he was different, and he was hunted in his own home. Mel's most chilling revelation from this period is the bedroom lock. Rob Reiner, the man who championed open communication, was now locking his own bedroom door at night to protect himself and Michelle from their own son. It was a heartbreaking admission that the perfect shot Rob tried to direct for his son's recovery was spiraling into a script he could no longer control. Mel Brooks's account shifts from the clinical progression of a disease to the intimate, agonizing reality of a hostage situation where the captor was the child and the bars of the cell were made of parental love. Mel describes a concept he calls the Hollywood disease, which is a unique form of financial and emotional extortion that thrives in the elite ecosystem. In the years leading up to 2025, Mel explains that Nick Reiner had mastered a devastating narrative that his struggles were the reparations owed to him for the trauma of being raised in the spotlight. Mel reveals that Rob was being drained of millions, not for lifestyle luxuries, but for what Nick called survival equity. It was a cycle of financial abuse, where every refusal by Rob was met with threats of public self-destruction. Rob felt he could never stop paying for the past. The Brentwood estate, which should have been a sanctuary of peace for a couple in their 70s, became a fortress of fear. Mel recounts a chilling detail from a dinner they shared in late 2024. Rob admitted that the enabling was not just about money anymore, but about physical space. Nick had moved back into the main house and began claiming rooms. Mel's voice cracks when he describes the boundary of the locked door. Rob Reiner was spending his nights behind a deadbolt in his own master suite. He was not locking the world out, but he was locking his son out. Mel pleaded with him to involve professional security or the police, but Rob's response was always that if he treated him like a criminal, he would become one. This, Mel argues, is the ultimate tragedy of the Reiner legacy. Rob and Michelle were prisoners of their own empathy. They believed that the boundless Reiner love that had sustained 3 generations could somehow rewire a brain broken by psychosis. They were waiting for a third-act redemption that Mel knew in his gut was never written into this script. Mel Brooks reveals that the tragedy was not a failure of information, but a failure of action. He recounts a specific, chilling moment during a small, intimate holiday gathering last year that remains etched in his mind as the moment the shadow turned into a predator. The atmosphere in the room was tight, like a wire about to snap, as Mel watched Nick watching his father. Mel describes a look in Nick's eyes that was not the look of a son, but of a predator assessing its prey. During the gathering, Rob Reiner made a classic self-deprecating joke that filled the room with laughter, except for one person. Nick did not laugh, and he just stared, with a cold, hollow gaze that sent a shiver through Mel's spine. Later that night, Mel pulled Rob aside and physically grabbed him by the shoulders to emphasize the gravity of the situation. He pleaded with his friend, saying that he needed to get him out because he did not look at him with love, but with ownership. But Rob, in his unwavering devotion, pulled away and was offended by the suggestion. He told Mel that he sounded like the critics and insisted that Mel did not know Nick's pain. Mel breaks down during the interview at this point, weeping for the little boy he used to bounce on his knee, who grew into a man who could no longer distinguish between being loved and being enabled. Mel also directs a furious anger toward the professional systems that surrounded the family, calling the therapists and consultants accomplices. He reveals that there were people on the payroll who minimized the threat, telling Rob and Michelle that tough love was outdated and that they needed to practice radical acceptance. These professionals sterilized the threat, giving clinical names to what Mel saw as homicidal tendencies. They told the family it was a disorder, when in reality, it was a death sentence. Mel feels he failed as the patriarch because he did not call the police himself, but he insists that the world must know the truth, that Rob was sacrificed by a system that chose to tell him what he wanted to hear, rather than what he needed to know. The clinical timeline released by the police provides a cold, detached account of the afternoon of December 14, 2025, including the discovery of Rob and Michelle in the master bedroom, with multiple sharp force injuries. But Mel Brooks knows the reality of the hours before, because in the middle of that final night, Rob Reiner called him. It was late, and Mel was already in bed when the phone rang. He admits he hesitated, but a lifelong instinct made him pick up. When he did, he heard a whisper. Rob was calling to say goodbye, though he never used the words. He told Mel that the house was heavy again, and that Nick was spiraling and screaming about the will. Mel describes the urgency he felt, shouting into the receiver for Rob to leave and come to his house. It was then that Rob delivered the sentence that Mel says transforms this from a crime report into a Greek tragedy. Rob replied that he could not leave Michelle because she was in the room with him, trying to calm him down. Rob said that if he left, his son would turn all the anger on her. Rob Reiner stayed in that house, knowing the volatility, and knowing the monster they had tried to love back to health was standing in the next room. He walked back into the darkness to protect his wife, which was a final act of devotion that Mel Brooks believes was his friend's true cause of death. That whisper was the last time Mel ever heard his voice. When news broke the next morning that Nick had been arrested, Mel did not need to read the charges because he already knew the script had reached its final, silent page. Mel Brooks now sits in a room filled with the ghosts of a century, looking like a man stranded on an island of memories. At 99, he is the last patriarch standing and the final witness to a dynasty that was built on laughter but ended in an unimaginable silence. He tells us that the hardest part is not the anger, but the fact that the phone no longer rings for Sunday dinner. This unvarnished truth is Mel's final gift to his friend. He does not want Rob remembered as a headline or a victim of a random crime, but as a man who died trying to be the father he thought his son needed. But Mel also leaves us with a horrific signal flare for every family in Hollywood and beyond, that you cannot love the violence out of someone. He warns that while Nick held the weapon, a network of enablers and a Hollywood disease of radical acceptance sharpen the blade. As we wait for the trial, let the image of Mel Brooks weeping for the boy he once bounced on his knee serve as a reminder that fame protects you from nothing. The Reiner legacy will live on in the films that made us believe in true love, but its final chapter is a sobering lesson in the limits of the human heart. Mel Brooks has spent a lifetime exposing the absurdities of the world, making us laugh at death itself. But he cannot find the absurdity in this. There is only the cold, hard reality of a family destroyed from the inside. As the journalist prepared to leave, Mel grabbed his arm with one last message: to get out, to warn others. He wants the enablers exposed, and he wants the industry to hear the truth. Mel Brooks is done protecting the secrets and the image, and he is protecting the truth now. The loss of Rob Reiner is a wound in the heart of Hollywood, but the lesson of his death, delivered by his oldest friend, might be the only thing that can prevent it from happening again.